With Diablo being unveiled at BlizzCon, there was a lot of talk about class sets, and so you had players who were saying they definitely did not want class sets to return like they had in Diablo 3, and then you had the developers kind of making it a note to like definitely assure players that that was not going to be the case. And while I can appreciate that, I think it actually kind of misses the main point that whether or not class sets return is not really the issue. So let me explain why. And to do that, we're going to need to start talking a little bit about balance. And so balance is where you ensure that no skill has an inherent advantage over another. So that means that skills have an equivalent DPS or effects, and that they're otherwise comparable. But that's not just limited to skills, right? This is basically anywhere where you offer player choice. So things like equipment, talents, passives, so on and so forth. What you really want to do is when you have a player choice, you've got these options. You don't want the options to be weighted towards one or the other. Now, in like a competitive environment, that's pretty obvious, right? So competitive sports, the ideal is kind of the foundation actually, is you really want there to be an even playing field among all the competitors. What does it matter in a PvE game? Well, one of the biggest reasons is that it allows the players to capture a fantasy, right? That's what balance enables. And so, for example, if you imagine something like a samurai, there may be a player who really thinks samurai is cool, and so they want to play a character that captures that fantasy of a samurai. So what does that mean? Well, that means like prefer to use light armor rather than heavy armor. They're primarily going to want to wield a two-handed sword, and then they want to use that weapon as kind of their primary weapon for attacking and also defense. So for example, maybe deflecting or blocking or their defensive skills. And then they don't really want to base the character on magic. So for example, they don't want to hit with their sword and have the enemy catch on fire or something. But if the game isn't balanced, it's going to prohibit players from doing that. It's really going to restrict them. And it can result in this phenomenon that players often refer to as the illusion of choice, where yeah, the game offers you choices, so to speak, but your choices are really kind of guided to what is really more powerful than other things. And so, for example, what happens is you might have on-hit effects. And so there's a certain percentage chance when you hit things that an effect is going to occur. Well, obviously that's going to make players want to hit as frequently as possible so that they can get more effects going off. And so if your game has like two-handed weapons that are just innately slower than one-handed weapons, then you're going to be kind of compelled to use one-handed weapons instead of that two-handed weapon that you really want to use. And what's further complicated, though, is that oftentimes choices are sort of obfuscated by these hidden or unforeseen mechanics. So things like breakpoints are a big deal here. And this is where like choices are kind of weighted towards one thing that's going to be actually more effective. But the game doesn't even communicate that, and so the players don't even know what's going on. So for example, a player might find an item that has 10% increased attack speed, and they're comparing it to another item that has like a main stat, for example. And they're like, whoa, this attack speed weapon is like, wait, it's increased my DPS, and my sheet DPS goes up. It's like, this is going to be awesome. But the reality might be that they haven't hit the next breakpoint, and so not only does that attack speed item do nothing, but they're actually losing that main stat benefit, so they're losing damage when they think they're gaining it, and that's a big problem. And then finally, these kinds of imbalances can reduce customization. So when Diablo 3 was being developed, they had this BlizzCon panel where they talked about how runes was like this marquee customization feature of the game. And so they teased this figure of 97 billion builds per class. They were kind of saying like, hey, look at how much customization this game is. You're going to get in this game and you can pretty much play almost anything you could think of. Well, we all know that happens. You can hardly think of a skill in which there's pretty much not one rune that you're going to use over any other rune. I want to illustrate some balance, right? How we can kind of approach balancing these skills. So if you consider two skills, Firebolt and Ice Bolt, these skills pretty much function the same, or they shoot out a projectile that deals some damage. And so we want to have the goal of balancing these skills. And so we might do something like this, right? Make the mana cost for both skills 3. They're both going to do the same damage. But there's a catch here, right? Because Ice Bolt deals cold damage. And what does cold damage do? Well, it chills. And so that's going to slow enemies. Clearly, if you're looking at this, you have an obvious advantage to Ice Bolt, right? It's going to be much more effective than Firebolt. Like, there's no reason to pick Firebolt because Ice Bolt does exactly what Firebolt does, but more. We have to ask ourselves, well, okay, well, how are we going to balance this? Well, one thing we can do, for example, is you might think, well, let's increase the damage of Firebolt so that, you have the reason to pick it over the chilling effect. Well, what that's going to do is that's just going to outright increase the DPS of Firebolt, in this case by 20%. Ultimately, you're going to have to kill things whether or not the enemies are slowed. And so this 20% damage increase is going to be like 20% faster dungeon clears, 20% faster farming, and in terms of Diablo 3, this would be like an additional greater rift that you can clear. Seems to be that this gives Firebolt kind of this inherent advantage over Ice Bolt. Kind of flips the tables. Okay, so what if instead we did something like we changed the mana cost, right? And we increased the mana cost of Ice Bolt to account for this additional chilling effect it does. Well, the effect of that is actually going to depend a lot between the relationship between the mana recovery, your mana costs, and your cast rate. And so, for example, if we initially increase the mana cost, that's going to tend to lower the effective DPS because you can't sustain the skill as much as you could Firebolt. That's going to change, though, as you increase your mana recovery, because as you increase your mana recovery, that's going to totally negate that effect of that mana cost, making it irrelevant, in which case Ice Bolt is once again just clearly the superior skill. But then cast rate can also come into play, and as you increase your cast rate, that's once again going to increase the mana consumption, and that's going to offset that mana recovery. Which skill is better here is like, well, I don't know. It really depends on my equipment, my build, and so on and so forth. So that gets really complex very quickly. So maybe we'll add an effect to Firebolt, right? Ice Bolt has an effect, so we'll add one to Firebolt, then they'll be balanced. Well, what does fire do? Well, I don't know. It sets things on fire, so I guess that does more damage. Well, then once again, all that does is increase Firebolt's DPS. And so you can see how even with a very simple skill, it can actually be really complex to balance these. But there is one simple solution we can do, which is, of course, just remove the slow from Ice Bolt, in which case they're pretty much functionally identical skills, and so they're balanced. And so while it might be more boring, it at least is more balanced. But there's a problem with Diablo 3, and it's the fact that even if you could hypothetically perfectly balance every skill, perfectly balance every item, and so on, the skill system still makes it impossible to balance builds in the game. So let me illustrate that. Let's imagine we're making a build for a Witch Doctor with the following skills. So if we look at this build, you've got Acid Cloud, which is, good skill for AoE damage. Corpse Spider's pretty good skill for like single targets. There's like offensive and defensive buff. Grasp of the Dead provides some CC. And then Spirit Walk, it gives you mobility and vulnerability. And then you have Zombie Dogs for just some extra bodies on the field, extra damage, pretty useful anyways. So this is a really coherent build. And so if your goal is to balance this game and balance the builds, like this is the kind of typical of a build that you want to make sure is viable. Well, let's compare this build to another build that looks like this. So here we have player picked the same skill, Acid Cloud, because they really like that skill. But maybe this player also really likes the DOT effects and the DOT theme. So they put on Locust Swarm and Haunt. They also throw on Zombie Dogs, but you know what? They just love pets. So just throw all the pets in there. So they end up with a build like this. What you should notice with these skills is that these 5 skills all deal damage simultaneously. And in fact, these skills can be dealing damage while the Witch Doctor casts Acid Cloud. And so what that means is this build actually has 6 skills that can be dealing damage all at the same time. Build A, on the other hand, only has 2. Now, Acid Cloud and Corpse Spiders can't deal damage simultaneously because at any given time, the Witch Doctor has to cast a skill, and they can only cast Acid Cloud or Corpse Spider, so it's only one or the other. How are we going to balance these builds? We have to basically make sure that the DPS of the builds is equivalent. And so keep in mind, remember that we're even assuming kind of the perfect scenario in which all skills are balanced. So this kind of ratio between any given skill is perfectly balanced. It's 1-to-1. So what does the DPS of these builds look like? Well, the combined DPS of build A is going to be the damage of Acid Cloud and that of Zombie Dogs because they can deal damage at the same time. And for build B, on the other hand, all 6 of its skills are going to be dealing damage simultaneously. So all of their DPS has to be combined. And so we end up with this equation here. Well, with some simple algebra, you can come up with this. And what this means is that the combined DPS of Locust Swarm, Haunt, Gargantuan, and Fetish Army all has to be equal to 0. And of course that's absurd. There's only one solution to this equation, and that's if the DPS of every single one of these skills is 0. In other words, the only way to solve this problem is to remove the skills from the game. Clearly, this does not work, right? This is a broken system here. And no amount of numbers can affect this, right? There's only one solution. 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 is equal to 0. Or you can't have negative skill damage. It doesn't make sense. And this solution can't merely be solved by adjusting numbers on skills. For example, if you look at build A, you can't just increase the damage of zombie dogs, right? Adjust its numbers, because these builds are linked, and so that change is going to affect another build. And you can't change a different skill because that's going to affect some other build. Really what you need in order to balance these builds is you really need some way to adjust these builds independently from one another. And you can't do that with the skills alone. And so that's where class sets come in. Class sets in Diablo 3 are this game system that they implemented that enable adjusting sets independently. And they do so because they have these independent multipliers, right? These skill multipliers that increase the damage. So if we look at how that might look with our example set, for build A, we're gonna design a set for that class, and just like for build B. And so for set A, it's gonna have a 12 times damage multiplier for all 3 of its skills. Meanwhile, set B is gonna apply a 4 times multiplier for all the skills that it uses in this build. We can do that because these sets are mutually exclusive, right? You can't equip both sets simultaneously. These multipliers that they provide are independent from one another. So if we look back to what our equation that we had, if we now take into account the multipliers, build A has 2 factors of 12, and build B has 6 factors of 4. And so of course the result of that is that 24 is equal to 24. So that means these sets are not, or these builds are now balanced, right? Their effective DPS is going to be equivalent. So there's no inherent advantage to playing with build A as opposed to playing with build B. Think back to how this ties into Diablo 4. There's one really important aspect to keep in mind here that needs to be understood. And that's the fact that class sets were not the problem in Diablo 3. Class sets were a solution to a problem. And so even if you think that class sets were terrible and that they were a failure of a solution, that doesn't mean that they were the problem to begin with, right? So if you remove class sets, you're just removing the solution that didn't work, but you're still left with the fundamental problem to begin with. When I look at Diablo 4, I look at, we'll call them challenges with the skill system. And so if you look at, so here's the skill system, and one thing I noticed right off the bat is these arbitrary skill categories. So things like, conjuration, major destruction, what do these mean? What are these categories? And, this is not just like a criticism of terminology. For example, like this skill is Meteor, okay? So what makes Meteor a quote-unquote mastery skill rather than, say, like a major destruction skill, right? It costs mana, just deal some damage. What's the difference, right? Other than the fact that maybe they ran out of room on the UI, I guess. The answer, of course, is right, at least right now, is obviously there's no difference, right? There's no functional difference, because the idea of a category is that category groups things based on some kind of characteristic, right? So in other words, what is the characteristic of a mastery skill that justifies it being a mastery skill as opposed to any other category of skill? And that's what's really lacking right here at the moment. What is this game communicating? Well, if you look at this, you pick one skill within this category of skills. And really what this demands is that these skills are balanced, right? This ties back to what we talked about originally. You only get to pick one of these skills. Well, ideally then, you want these skills to be balanced, right? You want to make sure that there's no inherent advantage to picking one over another. If we look at this example we had with the Firebolt and Ice Bolt, we could conceive of like a skill category to which these both belong. And the player can only choose one of them. But the fact that the player can only choose either Firebolt or Ice Bolt, it actually is completely natural, because they're almost redundant skills, right? There's no reason to pick both of them. You're only going to want to pick one. There's only a reason to pick one of them. As we went through before, you can balance these skills so that one isn't, at least as best as possible, you can balance them so that one isn't clearly or inherently better than the other. If we consider these skills that we have in this tier, this defensive tier for the sorceress, some of the skills we have on here look like this. We've got ice armor, blizzard, and teleport. Right? And there's like a major problem with this category, in that these skills are not comparable whatsoever. Right? They're totally different mechanically. There's no characteristic here that all of these skills share. Teleport, for example, doesn't deal any damage. It has a cooldown, while blizzard has mana cost, it's an AoE damage ability, and then finally you have ice armor, which is like this passive effect, doesn't cost anything, and it's this buff that's always in effect. And so there's no redundancy here, there's no similarities here, and so when you're faced with this idea of like, oh, here's the skill category, pick a skill, and whichever skill you pick is going to be equivalent, or a matter of preference, for example, there's just nothing going on here like that. You could use all three of these skills in a build. And so this category they have currently with this defensive category just makes no sense whatsoever. And the problem here is that if you have these incoherent skill categories, people are going to want to pick skills within the same category because they're so different and diverse, right? They really don't even make sense to be grouped together. So what that's going to mean, you're going to have an elective mode. And if you have elective mode, well then you're just right back to where we are with Diablo 3, because they're fundamentally based on the same concept. You know, there is good news. You know, it's not all doom and gloom, because it's still really early in the game. You know, I'm not saying this is something that can't be fixed or that can't be looked at. Worst case scenario, this is just a first draft. What is possible is that they haven't even thought of the skill system yet, that this is just like placeholder, because they needed something for a demo and they needed a little interface where you could select some skills and try them out in game. Right now it seems like the community thinks that, oh, class sets are the problem, class sets are the problem. That's not really the case, right? I'm not saying class sets are good or that they have to make a return, or that they're going to improve the game. I'm not saying anything like that. Rather, I'm just saying you have to actually identify the problem accurately, because if you don't, it doesn't matter how early it is. You can iterate, and if you're iterating on like the non-issue, then you'll never fix the problem. And so it's really important to make sure you identify that problem so you can count for it in your design. So I hope that made sense. If you have any topics that you kind of want me to go over, just let me know in the comments.